I wasn't hired to save the billionaire's dying father. I was hired to be the perfect alibi for an organized scheme that would cost me everything. The moment I stepped into that mansion, I realized the man paying my salary was a carefully crafted lie, and the silence in the hallways was just waiting for me to scream. The heavy oak doors of the Sterling estate didn't just close, they sealed you off from the world. I stood in the foyer, my suitcase feeling lighter than a feather, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wasn't here for the prestige, and I certainly wasn't here for the billionaire himself, Julian Sterling. I was here for the old man, Arthur, whose health had been declining with such terrifying speed that his son was willing to pay a king's ransom for a private live-in nurse who wouldn't ask too many questions. Julian met me by the grand staircase, his eyes cold, analytical, and devoid of any warmth. He was a man who looked at people like they were variables in an equation he was constantly trying to balance. He wore a suit that probably cost more than my entire education, and his posture was so rigid it seemed as if he were bracing for an impact that only he could foresee. He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he gestured toward the winding hallway. "My father is asleep. His meds are in the bureau. Your room is at the end of the hall. Don't wander." It was a test. I knew it immediately. The way he hovered, the way he lingered on the word wander, it was a lure. Millionaires like Julian don't just hire strangers to look after their vulnerable kin without putting them through a gauntlet of suspicion. He was looking for a leak, a thief, or perhaps someone who could be coerced into becoming a pawn in his vast, tangled business web. He had spent the last hour explaining the house rules with an intensity that bordered on paranoia, mentioning internal security and background checks, as if he were protecting a vault of forbidden secrets rather than an ailing man's bedroom. The first 3 days were a blur of antiseptic scents and the rhythmic wheezing of Arthur Sterling's labored breathing. The house was a mausoleum of wealth, silent save for the grandfather clock that told every hour, vibrating through the floorboards. Julian was rarely seen, though I felt his presence in every corner. It was in the way the lights dimmed automatically when I entered a room, the way the cameras hummed behind the ornate molding, and the way the pantry was always restocked with exactly what I had mentioned in passing. It was a prison disguised as a palace. Then came the 4th night. Julian had announced he was leaving for a board meeting in the city, an absence that would last at least 24 hours. As his luxury sedan crunched over the gravel driveway, a silence descended upon the house that felt heavier than usual. It was thick, expectant, and suffocating. I checked on Arthur. He was deep in a medically induced slumber, his pale skin translucent in the moonlight. I retreated to my room, but sleep eluded me. Every shadow in this house seemed to possess a hidden agenda. At 2 a.m, I decided to go to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I walked past the study, the room Julian had expressly forbidden me from entering, the room he claimed housed sensitive corporate data, I stopped dead in my tracks. The heavy mahogany door, which had been locked with a biometric scanner for the past 4 days, was ajar, just an inch. The faint golden glow of a desk lamp spilled out onto the Persian rug like a beckoning finger. My breath hitched. This was it, the trap. He wanted to see if I would succumb to the temptation of looking inside. He wanted to see if I was a common thief or a nosy spy. Logic screamed at me to walk away, to go back to my room, lock the door, and pretend I hadn't seen the invitation. But then I caught a scent. It wasn't the smell of old paper or expensive ink. It was sharp, metallic, and distinctly chemical. It smelled like the illicit substances they warned us about in medical school, the kind of materials that carry the weight of a heavy criminal charge. Curiosity, that fatal human flaw, pulled me toward the door. I reached out, my fingers hovering just inches from the wood. I thought of the enormous sentence that would surely follow if I were caught snooping, the threat of being buried under a mountain of legal trouble orchestrated by a man with unlimited resources. I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't even be looking at that door. But as I leaned in, I heard a voice, a raspy, frantic whisper coming from deep within the study. It wasn't Julian. It was a man, terrified and pleading, and he was describing where the packages were hidden. My hand touched the door. It swung open silently, revealing the massive desk. But it wasn't the files that drew my eyes. In the center of the desk, surrounded by stacks of encrypted ledgers, sat a heavy black case. And lying right next to it, discarded as if it were a common toy, was a piece of illegal weaponry that had absolutely no business being in a private home. My blood ran cold, but before I could retreat, a cold, hard sensation pressed firmly against the small of my back. A voice, smooth as velvet and sharp as a razor, whispered into my ear from the darkness of the room. "I knew you were curious, nurse. But curiosity in this house doesn't just kill the cat. It leaves no trace that the cat ever existed." The cold metal against my spine felt like a death warrant. I didn't dare turn around, my entire body locking into a rigid, paralyzed state. The air in the study, previously stale and dusty, suddenly felt frigid. The voice belonged to a man I didn't recognize. It was gravelly, unrefined, and devoid of the polished, arrogant veneer Julian maintained. This wasn't the billionaire. This was someone far more dangerous. Someone who operated in the shadows where Julian's legitimate business empire allegedly ended and the organized scheme began. "Don't move, sweetheart," the man hissed, his breath hot against my neck. "You've stumbled into a conversation you really shouldn't be privy to, and honestly, it's a shame. You were doing so well with the old man." My mind raced, trying to formulate an escape, but my limbs felt like lead. I remembered the heavy, illegal weaponry resting on the desk just inches away, and the packages of substances that were likely worth a fortune on the street. Everything about this room suggested that the Sterling Empire was built on a foundation of shifting, treacherous soil. If Julian were involved in this, then my presence here wasn't just a job, it was a liability. I was a witness to an enterprise that could result in a massive, life-altering sentence for everyone involved. "I'm just here for the water," I whispered, my voice trembling, hoping to sound pathetic enough to be dismissed. "I didn't see anything. I'll go back to the room. You won't hear a word from me." The man chuckled, a sound that lacked any mirth. "That's the thing about you nurses. You're trained to observe. You're trained to notice when a heart rate spikes or a respiration count changes. You notice details, and you've noticed far too many." Suddenly, he shoved me forward. I stumbled, my hands splaying out against the polished mahogany of the desk. My fingers brushed against the cold steel of the illegal weapon. I didn't grab it. I wasn't a fool, but the sheer proximity of it made my skin crawl. The man stepped into the light, and I finally got a look at him. He wasn't a guard. He was middle-aged, wearing a plain maintenance uniform, but his eyes were those of a predator who had spent his life in the dark corners of the city, working for the organized network Julian supposedly despised in public. "Where is Julian?" I asked, my voice gaining a sliver of strength, though my heart was still hammering. "Julian?" the man sneered. "Julian is the one who orchestrates the flow. He's the one who signs off on the logistics. He's the one who makes sure the internal security, the people he calls his staff, look the other way when the shipments arrive. He's not a businessman, kid. He's a middleman for a massive hidden power structure. And you were just supposed to be the perfect alibi, a trained medical professional, a witness to the declining health of a man who, let's be honest, hasn't actually been sick in months." My head spun. Arthur wasn't sick? The medication, the wheezing, the pale skin, it was all a performance? A staged tableau to keep me busy, to keep me compliant, and to keep the world away from this room? The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't hired to provide care. I was hired to be a prop, a human curtain to block the view of the rot behind the sterling name. Why tell me this? I breathed, realizing that if he was confessing, he had no intention of letting me walk out of the room. Because, he said, pulling a silencer from his pocket and slowly screwing it onto the barrel of a pistol he produced from his belt. Julian isn't coming back tonight. He's busy finalizing a deal with the local authorities to ensure that any accidents in this house are written off as tragic, isolated incidents. And you, nurse, are the perfect candidate for a tragic accident. He cocked the weapon. The sound echoed in the massive, hollow house like a thunderclap. My heart sank. There was no escape. The windows were reinforced, the door was heavy, and the man between me and the hallway was trained to kill without hesitation. "Any last requests?" he asked, stepping closer, the muzzle of the weapon now inches from my chest. I looked at the desk, looking for anything. A letter opener, a heavy lamp, anything to defend myself. My hand hit a button hidden beneath the desk ledge, a panic button I hadn't noticed before, or perhaps a secret compartment release. A hidden drawer slid open with a soft click, and instead of a weapon, it revealed a thick, leather-bound folder labeled Internal Investigation, Sterling Logistics. The man's eyes flickered to the folder for a split second, his distraction my only hope. As he reached to grab it, the house suddenly shuddered. A series of heavy metallic thuds sounded from the front foyer, the sound of the reinforced security doors being breached. Red strobe lights began to pulse in the hallway, and a voice, not the man's, but a cold, synthesized tone, boomed through the internal speakers. "Internal security breach detected. Containment protocol activated. All personnel must remain in place." The gunman froze, his eyes widening. "What did you do?" he hissed, turning his focus toward the doorway as heavy footsteps began to thunder down the hall. Before I could answer, the door to the study was kicked off its hinges. A man in tactical gear stood there, the emblem of the Service of Internal Safety on his vest. He didn't look at me. He looked at the gunman, then at the desk, and finally, his gaze locked onto me with a terrifying blank expression. He raised his own weapon, but he wasn't aiming at the intruder. He was aiming at me. "Target identified," he commanded into his radio. "Witness secured. Proceed with the cleanup." The tactical officer's gaze was like looking into a deep, frozen well. There was no humanity in it, no hesitation, no flicker of empathy for a woman caught in the middle of a nightmare. He saw a variable that needed to be subtracted from the equation. The gunman, realizing he had just been rendered obsolete by the arrival of the professionals, dropped his weapon, his face turning an ashen gray. "Wait, I was just following the arrangement." The boss said. The officer didn't even blink. With a practiced fluid motion, he pulled the trigger. A muffled pop resonated in the small, confined space of the study, and the man who had been holding me hostage collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut. I let out a choked gasp, pressing myself back against the shelves, my heart stuttering in my chest. This wasn't a rescue. This was a sanitization. "No witnesses," the officer muttered into his lapel microphone, his voice dead flat. He started moving toward me, his boots crunching on the pristine rug now stained with a spreading dark red blotch. He didn't seem interested in the ledgers or the illegal goods on the desk. He was interested in the one thing that could dismantle the Sterling Empire, the memory behind my eyes. I scrambled backward, knocking over a globe that crashed to the floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "I don't know anything," I shrieked, though we both knew it was a lie. I had seen the files, I had heard the confession, and now I had seen the true face of the internal security force that Julian Sterling had supposedly paid to keep his house safe. The officer stopped, his weapon still leveled at my chest. He tilted his head as if listening to a command only he could hear through his earpiece. His expression shifted from robotic efficiency to a momentary, jarring confusion. He paused, his finger hovering off the trigger. "Confirmed," he said, his voice lowering to a growl. "Change of plans. The subject is to be extracted, not terminated." "What?" I managed to gasp, my breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. He didn't explain. He grabbed my arm with a grip like steel, hauling me to my feet. My legs felt like jelly, but he dragged me out of the study and into the hallway. The house was no longer a silent mausoleum. It was alive with the sound of sirens far off in the distance and the rhythmic thrum of a helicopter circling the estate. "You're a high-value asset now," he muttered, pulling me toward a hidden service elevator that I hadn't even realized existed. "If you're smart, you'll stop asking questions and start memorizing what you're about to see." He shoved me inside the small, metallic box. As the door slid shut, the last thing I saw was the study and the body of the man who had been the middleman for the Sterling enterprise. But as the elevator began to descend into the bowels of the house, I realized the floor indicator wasn't moving down to the basement. It was showing sublevels that shouldn't have been on any architectural blueprint. B1, B2, B3, and finally, a blinking red light marked only with an asterisk. The elevator shuddered and came to a halt. The doors slid open to reveal a sterile, white corridor that looked more like a high-end research facility than a billionaire's home. And there, standing at the end of the hall, was Julian Sterling. He wasn't wearing his impeccable suit anymore. He was wearing a lab coat, his sleeves rolled up, his hands covered in a dark crimson stain that didn't look like ink. He looked at me, not with the coldness of a master to a slave, but with the terrifying, eager curiosity of a scientist looking at a new specimen. "Welcome to the inner sanctum, nurse," he said, his voice echoing in the sterile hallway. "I apologize for the dramatics upstairs. My security team is enthusiastic. But you see, you were never hired to take care of my father. You were hired to be the next host." My blood turned to ice. "Host?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Julian smiled, and for the first time I noticed the subtle, artificial glint in his eyes, a reflection that didn't quite match the overhead lights. He walked toward me, his gait slightly unnatural, as if he were still getting used to the way his muscles moved. Behind him, rows of glass pods stretched into the darkness, each one containing a figure that looked eerily like a person I recognized from the society pages. People who had disappeared or retired from public life months ago. "My father's condition is indeed a tragedy," Julian said, gesturing to the rows of pods. "But with the right adjustments and the right biological input, we've found a way to extend the influence of the Sterling line indefinitely. And you, my dear, have the perfect genetic markers for the next phase of our research." He signaled to the tactical officer, who stepped forward and clamped a pair of heavy electronic cuffs onto my wrists. I felt a sharp electric sting, and my vision began to blur at the edges. Julian leaned in close, his breath smelling of ozone and cold clinical chemicals. "Don't fight it. You're about to become part of something far greater than yourself. You're about to become part of the family." As the darkness threatened to pull me under, I saw something that shattered my remaining sanity. In the pod directly behind Julian, the face of the man who had been my patient, Arthur Sterling, pressed against the glass. His eyes were wide, panicked, and pleading, and then he mouthed 3 words that sent a jolt of terror through my entire being. "He isn't Julian." The realization hit me harder than any physical blow ever could. "He isn't Julian." The man standing before me, the one who orchestrated the disappearance of high-profile figures and played the part of the grieving, cold-hearted billionaire, was an imposter, a puppet. My vision swirled as the electric current from the cuffs pulsed through my nerves, making it difficult to keep my focus. But the sheer horror of the situation forced my brain into overdrive. Julian, or whoever this thing was, let out a low, vibrating hum of a chuckle that didn't sound like it originated from a human throat. He turned toward the pod where the real Arthur Sterling was trapped, his face a mask of detached interest. "The old man is so dramatic," the entity said, his fingers drumming rhythmically against his side. "He doesn't understand that he's merely the prototype. We are refining the biological architecture, smoothing out the imperfections of the original consciousness to create a truly efficient vessel for the network's future." My stomach turned. I realized then that the packages being moved, the illegal substances I'd seen in the study, weren't just standard illicit wares. They were synthetic catalysts, biological components designed to bridge the gap between organic human tissue and whatever consciousness was being uploaded or forced into these bodies. I was standing in a tomb for the living, a place where people were systematically erased and replaced by the network's cold, calculated designs. "What are you?" I managed to rasp, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. He tilted his head, his neck muscles moving in a way that looked like grinding clockwork. "We are the inevitability of progress." The Sterling line was a dying asset, a relic of an inefficient era. We simply optimized it. And you, with your medical background and your sharp, inquisitive mind, are the perfect neural substrate for our next upgrade. We don't just need bodies, we need minds that can process the complex logistics of our global expansion. I felt a surge of adrenaline, fueled by pure, unadulterated terror. As the tactical officer moved to lead me toward one of the empty pods, I realized my only chance was to exploit the one thing they couldn't account for: their arrogance. They looked at me as a specimen, not a threat. They assumed the shock of the situation had broken my will. I slumped, letting my knees hit the sterile floor, putting on the best performance of a woman who had given up. "If I'm going to be a part of this," I whispered, keeping my eyes cast downward, "at least tell me, is there anything left of the original Julian? Or is he entirely gone?" The imposter paused, a flicker of what looked like genuine annoyance passing across his features. He stepped closer, leaning down to stare directly into my face, his eyes shifting with a strange, bioluminescent hue. The original was weak. He was plagued by doubt and a pathetic, lingering morality. We excised that days ago. He is currently resting in a containment unit deep within the sub-basements, waiting for his final recycle. There is nothing left of him but raw biological material. He had stepped into my trap. As he leaned in, his proximity allowed me to see the maintenance port at the base of his skull, a thin, glowing seam where his skin met the synthetic interface. Using every ounce of my remaining strength, I lunged forward, not at him, but at the control console mounted on the wall behind him. I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached for the emergency fire suppression system, which I had learned during my orientation contained a heavy concentration of pressurized, hyper-chilled liquid nitrogen. I smashed my shackled hands into the manual override. A high-pitched alarm began to blare, and a sudden, violent hiss erupted from the ceiling. A cloud of freezing mist filled the hallway, turning the air instantly sub-zero. The entity shrieked, a sound that wasn't human, a digital scream of corrupted frequencies. I didn't wait to see if he would recover. I scrambled toward the pods, my fingers numb from the cold, searching for any sort of manual release. I found a lever on Arthur's pod, yanked it down with all my weight, and the heavy glass panel hissed open. The smell of ancient, preserved air rushed out, and Arthur collapsed into my arms, gaunt and skeletal, but very much alive. "Run!" he gasped, his eyes darting toward the corridor where the entity was struggling to reboot its functions, its body twitching violently as the liquid nitrogen wreaked havoc on its internal cooling systems. We stumbled toward the emergency staircase, my lungs burning, the cold of the lab biting into my skin. We pushed open the heavy steel door to the ground floor, but instead of the grand foyer I remembered, we found ourselves in a vast subterranean hangar. And parked in the center, bathed in the harsh glare of searchlights, were a dozen black, unmarked drones and a series of high-speed transport vehicles. Suddenly, The voice of the entity boomed over the hangar's speakers, distorted and rage-filled. "You think you can escape the network? The exit is sealed, the perimeter is locked down, and we have already accounted for every possible exit route. But since you are so eager to see the world outside, I have a surprise for you." The wall of the hangar began to slide open, revealing not the peaceful, forested estate grounds, but a dark, industrial wasteland that stretched as far as the eye could see. A landscape of chimneys, smoke, and sprawling, neon-lit towers that I didn't recognize. We weren't in the state I thought we were. We weren't even in the same country. "Welcome to the New Order," the entity's voice thundered. "You've finally left the cage only to realize the entire world is now our property." As I stared out at the hellscape, I saw a familiar ship descending from the clouds, a transport marked with the same logo as the Internal Security Service. And as the landing gear hit the ground, the doors opened and a dozen figures stepped out, all wearing the face of the man who had been my boss. The air outside was thick with the scent of ozone and burning sulfur, a harsh, synthetic environment that felt nothing like the world I had left behind. As the dozens of identical men stepped off the transport craft, their synchronized movements and blank, cold gazes solidified the nightmare. I wasn't just in a house of horrors. I was in the heart of an empire that had already consumed the world. Arthur clung to my arm, his trembling frame a fragile anchor in this sea of clones. They took everything," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The research, the clinics, the infrastructure. It was all under the guise of improving the future. I only realized too late that I was funding the end of humanity." The clones began to fan out, their movements precise and predatory. The lead figure, the same one I had encountered in the lab, stepped forward. His synthetic skin was already beginning to knit itself back together after the blast of liquid nitrogen, though his gait remained unnervingly mechanical. He didn't carry a weapon. He didn't need to. He stood in the center of a legion of his own making, a manifestation of total control. "You are a fascinating outlier," the entity said, his voice echoing across the desolate tarmac. "Most subjects succumb to the conditioning within hours. You, however, have demonstrated a capacity for chaotic adaptation that we find intriguing. We could discard you as we discarded the others, or we could integrate you. Think of the reach you would have. Think of the lives you could save with our algorithms. The world is a broken system, and we are the patch that stabilizes it." His words were a seductive, poisoned promise. For a split second, I felt the sheer weight of their power, the way they owned the air, the ground, and every digital signal that crisscrossed this wasteland. It would be so easy to surrender, to stop the running, to accept the upgrade. But then I looked at Arthur, the man whose life had been stripped away by this parasite, and I remembered the face of every patient I'd ever lost. I remembered that true humanity wasn't about efficiency or immortality. It was about the messy, painful, unpredictable spark of life that these things could never replicate. "I'd rather die," I said, my voice steady, ringing out against the mechanical drone of the hangar. The entity sighed, a sound that was less of a frustration and more of a disappointment. A common, yet disappointing, biological defect. Very well. Cleanup. Initiate total erasure. As the clones raised their hands, preparing to strike, I did the only thing I had left. I pulled the small encrypted drive I had swiped from the desk in the study during our chaotic escape. A drive I hadn't dared to look at until now. I slammed it into a high-gain transmission port located on the side of one of the hangar's massive observation pillars. I knew exactly what it was. It wasn't a set of ledgers. It was the master kill switch code Arthur had frantically whispered about in the pod. It was the original source frequency for the network's command structure. I hit the broadcast button. The effect was instantaneous and violent. A piercing, high-frequency screech erupted across the entire facility. The clones froze, their bodies convulsing as the code tore through their synthetic interfaces, causing their internal systems to overload. Sparks showered from their eyes and mouths, and the collective hive mind frequency shattered, turning their calculated precision into a chaotic, flailing mess. They collapsed, one by one, into heaps of smoldering, expensive wire and synthetic flesh. The entity in front of me didn't fall immediately. He clutched his head, his face flickering like a dying television screen, his features distorting into a dozen different masks before settling back into the cold, blank stare of the imposter. You have no idea what you have undone," he spat, his voice glitching into a static-filled roar. "I know exactly what I'm doing," I countered, looking him directly in the eyes. "I'm rebooting the world!" With one final ear-splitting surge of energy, the central command pillar exploded. A shockwave rippled through the hangar, knocking us off our feet. When the dust cleared, the silence was absolute. The clones lay motionless, their lights extinguished. The entity was gone, leaving behind nothing but a scorched suit and a pile of discarded inert components. Arthur and I sat amidst the ruin of the Sterling legacy, the dawn of a new, uncertain day beginning to break over the industrial horizon. The sky was no longer a neon-lit cage. The haze was clearing, revealing the true color of the sun for the first time in years. We were trapped in a wasteland, and we had a long, difficult road ahead to dismantle what remained of their network, but the grip of the artificial was broken. As I helped Arthur to his feet, I looked down at my hands. They were still trembling, but they were my own. No hidden ports, no synthetic interfaces, no forced future. We walked toward the distant edge of the compound, leaving the ghosts of the billionaire's ambition behind us. The story of the Sterling Empire had ended in fire and silence, but as the wind caught my hair and the smell of fresh, unfiltered air replaced the scent of chemicals, I knew that the story of us, the messy, flawed, and free, was just beginning. We were going home.